first question we have today. How important is reason as a guiding principle? Should we aim to behave rationally?
Well, from a scientific standpoint, yes. So, and I tend to be biased towards scientific thought processes, so I would say yes to that question.
So
What
you
do
think?
you mean?
Oh, I don't know. I try to put superstition aside, and I try and look at things with an informed opinion before I say things. So I don't know if that's reason per se, but I think that I would tend towards yes to this question. Maybe not in all cases, right? Because maybe you can make the argument that emotional judgment isn't particularly reasonable, but in most cases, reason is a good way to look at things.
Yeah, I think if we look at this, the question seems to aim towards behavior. So that makes me think, I'll try to rephrase it and see if, well, I guess see what you guys think. So, would you consider thinking ahead and using reason to assess your decisions, to make your decisions and sort of target your goals? Would that be the best way to behave, or is there more of an irrational, I guess, basis to guide yourself through?
I mean, it totally depends on what you're trying to make decisions for. But in most cases, I would argue that yes, that using logic and reason probably would give you a decent result. Obviously, this isn't true in every single case because, we're emotional beings, and sometimes we just want to feel good, right? Sometimes we just want to be happy. And in order to be happy, sometimes you just have to act irrationally. However, in most situations, when you're trying to look at something without being blinded by emotions, I would argue that reason and logic is a great way to make your decisions.
I'm going to try to stab at your argument there. That I agree with you on almost every front, except for maybe the most important front, which is that, yes, once you establish a goal, as you said, logic is going to be extremely helpful in figuring out how to get from point A, where you are now, to point B, where you want to be. But in my opinion, you can't use reason to determine what point B is. Reason can only tell you how to get to point B. But to figure out what point B is, you're going to have to look at what you desire and often what your cultural framework is and stuff like that.
I would disagree. I mean, not in all situations. Sometimes, if my end point is I want to be happy, right? That's not a logical thing. Being happy isn't particularly logical. But let's say my end goal is I want to graduate college. That's a logical goal, right? The reason I want to graduate college is so I can get a degree, and then that will increase my hireability and give me a sustainable life in the future. That's a logical end goal, that I arrived at that end goal through logic. So I would say that in some cases, you can definitely use logic to determine what point B is.
So I would argue that graduating from college in the case that you just gave is merely a means to the end of living what you described as a sustainable life. So you have point A, which is where you are now, a student at UMS Lowell. They have point B, which is living a sustainable life. And then you use logic to figure out that the way to get to the sustainable life for you at this time in your life, well, logically the right thing for me to do is finish my degree and get a job with that degree and everything that you just described. And I agree that's logical. What's completely illogical, in my opinion, is the desire to have a sustainable life.
I think that's totally logical. I don't. Why would someone want? So even from a purely logical standpoint, right? Why would I want to suffer? Because suffering usually tends to lead to death. Now, unless you want to die, which is a whole separate issue, right? But we want to tend towards life, right? We're naturally inclined to preserve ourselves. So I don't understand, like...
A natural inclination is not reasonable.
Right. It's sort of like you have natural urges, desires. Obviously, some of them is not to die, suffer, at least for most people. But I think ultimately reason is just your guiding principle to getting those irrationally obtained goals. And, you know, if you say some goal is rational, like graduating college, it's only rational on the basis of it being a means to an irrational goal.
Okay. I'm trying to think of how I can make a sustainable life logical. I'm failing to come up with any reasons at the moment, but...
There have been philosophers in the past that have attempted to do that, like Kant.
Aristotle, right? I mean, he talked about the, what was it? The meaningful life, or... No, something else. The planned life. I suppose that is different.
I think he was for like a perfect medium type of thing with life, like what virtue is and stuff. But I guess one thing I think that's important to mention in this conversation is that when, I guess, to like maybe step outside what like the conversation is right now, like when we say like suffering, like to desire suffer, to desire to not suffer is like a irrational sense. When we say that to like refute Tony, we are using a larger rational basis for when we say it's irrational. Right, we're arguing with Tony to say that his what he thinks is rational is not rational. But when we do that, we're using rational arguments in the first place. Right? And so it's like I don't know how you'd say it. It's like it's not a principle per se, but like I don't know how you would describe it. We're using it as a
tool.
I suppose.
A method.
But like it suggests that like even when we say that like goals are irrational, right? When we are saying that, we're using rational ways to get there. I don't know. I think that's an interesting point.
Are you... Well, I'll avoid putting words in your mouth. What I think... So I agree with you, first of all. And second of all, I think the implication of that is that reason is a reliable guide to truth.
I guess what I'm saying is that like in a sense the means are the ends. Like the tools are principles in themselves. Because why are we using reason in the first place? To convey truth if it's not a principle that guides us. Because I don't know, you can't really like flip it there, you know, and say like, oh, here at the beginning you have reason, and when we use reason, we figure out that our goals are irrational. Like, I feel like you need to have both irrational means to irrational goals. Eventually.
Is a point you're trying to make also that it, like, logic and reasoning is inescapable? Is that another point?
Well, no. Well,
Like,
at least in this conversation, it seems to be. Okay. But, like, you know, I think religion is a point at which, like, reason fails, really, and where you need to bring in faith. You know, and kind of axiomatic presuppositions of, like, ideologies and stuff that's not based in reason, that's just based in, like, being a human being.
Okay.
At least to some people. It really depends on what you think, but
okay.
I don't know. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're pretty much covered. At least, definitely your last answer just covered, I guess, where we should use rationality. I think I agree with your description of that. Yeah. I mean, I think it is useful in many situations, like far more than I'm afraid people actually use it. But yeah, I guess there's some matters in which I think it cannot be applied, and I think if reason is the only tool we ever had, we wouldn't be able to arrive at any knowledge.
I kind of want to apply an argument that I remember Jeremy Bentham made. He argued for, forget what he called it. I think it was called the pleasure principle or something. That everything boils down to a desire for pleasure. And he argued that whenever a philosopher or thinker of any kind tries to come up with, like, an alternative to the pleasure principle, that someone wants to that someone desires something other than pleasure, really they're just doing mental gymnastics, and if you continue to, like, press them, then you'll find that their justification for the principle, some other principle, I don't know, let's say it's virtue or something, the justification for why people pursue virtue fundamentally relies in the pursuit of pleasure. And so, analogously, I think that most of the time, if you find someone trying to use logic or reason to justify as an objective fact what they consider to be their highest value, really it's something they value anyway, and the logic is an unnecessary structure that they contrived to justify it to themselves, to feel more comfortable, so that they don't have to recognize the fact that their desires are based in nothing.
I think I disagree with that interpretation. At least with the way it was arrived. I guess with the interpretation itself too. I think there's a dangerous tool here that can be overused, and I think it often is overused, which is assigning motivation, basically, or assigning whatchamacallit, not motives, there's a different word. Intentions, right. You can assign intentions, like, say you want to talk about, let's just pick a casual example, right? I think Aristotle talked about a planned life and how you should always plan your life ahead of time, from what you're going to do the rest of this day to what you're going to do, you know, in 3 years and so on and so forth, in order to achieve a fulfilled life. Now you might say, oh, well, the only thing Aristotle is trying to do here is find pleasure, because he just knows, you know, if he has all of his plans written down. Was that Plato? I might be wrong.
Unexamined life is not worth living. I think that's Socrates.
Right, that was Socrates, but then I think there was a comeback or something that's like the
Oh.
unplanned life is not worth examining or something like that. Anyways, whoever of the top three it was, right, of the first three philosophers, whoever it was, we could assign the intention of arriving at pleasure, right? You can say, oh, well, they just find pleasure in having no surprises and having their life planned out or whatever. It gives them comfort to pretend to know the future. But the problem with that is it's both unprovable and undisprovable, I guess. Like, it can't be falsified either. So I could easily also say, oh, actually, Aristotle really has an intention to reach pain. He really loves pain, or hates pain, but wants to get it anyways. And so all Aristotle or Plato, whoever it was, wanted to get was as much pain as possible by forcing himself to make all these plans ahead of time, and get stuck with the details and always find out, oh, my plan didn't work out, so I'm a failure, and so on and so forth. And it's arbitrary. You can keep on assigning any intention you want. You could say they wanted, I don't know, they were really interested in having a world with more pots in it, right? So they thought, oh, all the pot makers out there, as soon as they may start planning their life better, they'll make more pots and I'll have more pots. Like, it's arbitrary, and I think it's overused to try and assign intentions when you really have no way of knowing what the intentions of the person is. I think the easiest way is listen to what they say their intentions are, and give them benefit of doubt unless you have a really good reason to think they're lying. It's kind of a tangent, but
no, that's fine. I can largely agree with that. I'm not trying to say that the arguments of any given philosopher are just strictly not worth paying attention to. But I'm saying, I think if they're trying to justify human nature or human ethics or human religion using reason, I think they're just fundamentally on the wrong path.
Okay. One of the claims made was that our end goals is always pleasure. Like, deep rooted at the end of the day, like the deepest, biggest desire is pleasure, right? And you're saying that pleasure is illogical. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I was just referencing Jeremy Bentham. I don't necessarily subscribe to his argument.
Your individual thoughts, but is it assumed that pleasure is not a logical thing?
Yeah, I don't think pleasure is logical at all.
Couldn't you make an argument that pleasure is logical?
Try making it.
Well, okay, so what is the opposite of pleasure? Pain. I think is one of the few things you could say is objectively not a good thing in high amounts. Like, in general, right? Pain is an indicator of something going wrong. Like, if my leg is in pain, there is a problem with my leg. My leg is not functioning in the proper way. So, I think, obviously it's not 100% objective, right? Pain bad, pleasure good. But I think it's a pretty strong indicator of, like, something is going wrong. This shouldn't be the way it is, compared to this is good. And I think I don't know if it's considered logical because it's not like 100% true, 100% false. But in general, I think you could make an argument that pleasure is good because it is not pain.
That rests on the idea that pain is bad.
Like, you're taking the axiom, we're saying, wanting to get pleasure is your axiomatic assumption. You make that assumption and then you build off your philosophy off of that. And you're saying, no, I can arrive at it using reason and logic from a different assumption. But then you just make the assumption, pain is bad. Therefore, pleasure good. It's still arbitrary.
That pain is bad.
Not really. Like, bad and good is not the same thing as well, I'm claiming it's not the same thing as pleasure and pain, but
I point to a natural example of like, okay, my leg is in pain. That is not good for my leg. That means my leg is not functioning in the way it should be. Like,
well, okay.
Like,
So-
and maybe
so then the axiomatic take is, the ultimate good is for things to function the way they were supposed to function, which is fine, but that's also an axiomatic claim. Well, you have to make an assumption at some point. You can't keep justifying everything using logic. That's sort of the point of the question, I think. Eventually, you're going to have to just say, this is true because.